Anyway, we are going to study some very current events that are taking place in the world today. And most of what we're going to study is historical. We're not going to read a lot of verses from the Bible. You say, well, then it's not biblical preaching. Well, you know, you need to look at the Bible, and then you need to look at the fulfillment of what the Bible says. And there's one particular verse that is going to guide our study together. And that verse is Revelation chapter 13 and verse 3. I'm sure you're acquainted with that verse. It speaks about the beast, also called the little horn, also called the abomination of desolation, and the man of sin, and the king of the north, and so on. We're told in that text that this system received a deadly wound, but its deadly wound was going to be healed. And so in the course of this weekend, we are going to talk about events that show that that wound is quickly being healed as I speak. Now, I'm going to be quoting a lot from different sources. And I don't expect you to write down all the quotations, so let me tell you what I'm going to do. I brought some cards where you can put your contact information. And what I'll do is, if you give me your email address, I will send you the 80 pages of material that I'm going to present here this weekend, free. And you can read all of the quotations at your leisure, slowly, and you can double check, you can go to the internet, you can look up those quotations in the original sources. So, I brought this stack of cards, and they will be up here, and if you wish, after the meeting this evening, you can fill out the card, make sure you give it to me, and then we will, within a couple of weeks, once the secretary gets all of the email addresses inputted, then we will be sending that out to you free of charge. Now, the title of what we're going to study is Thesis, Antithesis, and Synthesis. I see Dr. McDermott and his wife here. What we're going to study is new material. I'm in the process of writing 2 newsletter articles for our Secrets Unsealed newsletter. And much of the content that I'm going to share with you this weekend will be in those newsletter articles. The title is Thesis, Antithesis, and Synthesis. And you're probably wondering what that means. Well, probably many of you know that an individual called Karl Marx wrote a very famous book, Das Kapital. And he also co-authored a book titled The Communist Manifesto. He co-authored it with an individual called Friedrich Engels. And there, in those books, he referred to history, to the flow of human history, with the words thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. That's how Marx described history. Now, you're probably wondering why he referred to the flow of history with those words. So I'm going to read you 2 definitions. One of them we find in the Encyclopedia Britannica, and the other one I got from the internet, from Wikipedia. And you know, Wikipedia isn't always accurate, so you have to check all of the other sources to make sure that their description squares with reality. But the Encyclopedia Britannica describes thesis, antithesis, and synthesis in the following way. All things contain contradictory sides or aspects. So all things contain, according to this, contradictory sides or aspects, whose tension or conflict is the driving force of change. Now, the conflict between the two is the driving force for change. And then the last part of the definition is eventually transforms or dissolves them. In other words, dissolves the contradiction between the two sides, dissolves them. So in other words, the thesis and the antithesis are in total opposition. But the tension between the two eventually leads to the point of dissolving the tension, and this dissolves the contradiction between the two. In the other definition, we have the following explanation. The triad, thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, is a progression of three ideas or propositions, in which the first idea is followed by a second idea that negates the first. And the conflict between the first and the second ideas is resolved by a third idea. So in short, the idea is that in the flow of history, you have a movement that rises. Later on, you have a movement that is totally opposite to that one that arises. And the tension between the two eventually dissolves the tension, and they synthesize or they come together. Are you following the definitions? Now let's apply this paradigm to history as we find it in the book of Revelation. First of all, the thesis. As we all know, for 1260 years, the papacy had the states of Europe in submission to her agenda. And historians have shown that the result of the papacy dominating the secular states was basically ignorance, illiteracy, poverty, disease, wars, and civil unrest. During this period, there was a privileged class. The privileged class was composed of the clergy and the aristocracy, primarily the king. During this period, the church forbade the reading of the Bible to the laity. And as a result, society was in constant upheaval. That is the thesis. Now, what is the antithesis to the papacy controlling the secular states of Europe for 1260 years? The antithesis is composed of two movements. The first movement is the Protestant Reformation that arose against papal authority. In other words, Protestantism was an antithetical reaction to the papacy. And then, of course, later on, from 1793 to 1798, the secular states, beginning with France, arose against the papacy. In other words, turned against the papacy. The French Revolution thinkers inspired the proletariat, that is the common people, the poor, the underprivileged, the ignorant, the illiterate, and the sick, to rise against the privileged clergy and against the aristocracy that had colluded with the church for a period of 1260 years, approximately. The French Revolution, according to historians, was the precursor of the secular governments of the world, separated from religion, and also of socialist Marxism. So that is the antithesis. Thesis, the papacy controlling the states of Europe, the secular states, hiding the Bible. The antithesis, Protestantism, rises against the papacy. 1517 is the date that is usually given, and then culminates with the secular states of the world, beginning with France, become secular and turn against the church. Now, what is the synthesis? For many, many years, there was a conflict or controversy between the papacy and Protestantism and the secular powers. The synthesis will take place at the very end of human history. I believe that we're seeing it as we study this weekend. What is going to happen is that Protestantism, the tension between the papacy and Protestantism, the tension between the papacy and the secular powers of the world is going to disappear. It's going to dissolve. And these three systems are going to synthesize or come together. The conflict will be resolved. Are you following me or not? Now let's begin studying this antithetical relationship between the papacy and the secular governments of the world, and I'm going to refer particularly to communism or socialism. Let's begin our study with the relationship between the papacy and the secular powers of the world during most of the 20th century. The Cold War, many of you are old enough to remember the Cold War. Oh, for those days, right? Because at that time you had East and West. Now you have everything in disarray. But anyway, the Cold War began in 1947. And shortly thereafter, more specifically 4 years later, in 1951, an Australian evangelist by the name of Lewis Weir wrote about the enmity between the papacy and communism or socialism. And I want to read that statement. It's in a little book called Before Probation Closes. I want you to notice what he says about the enmity between the papacy and communism during the period of the Cold War. I read, "The world knows that atheistic communism and domineering Romanism are today in a death fight." So what was happening in 1951? Communism and Romanism, which is a term that was used to describe the papacy, are today, that is in 1951, in a death fight. And then he brings a third entity into the equation. He wrote, "We all know too that Protestantism is to Romanism as detestable an enemy as communism." So what was the relationship between the papacy and Protestantism in 1951? Enemies. What was the relationship between the papacy and the secular powers of the world, particularly represented by communism? Enmity. He continues, "Rome has no favors or peace with either." That is, with Protestantism or with communism or socialism. Today, by the way, it's called globalism. He continues, "Today, 1951, especially since Protestant democracies are at odds with Russia." So Protestantism was at odds with communism also. "Today, especially since Protestant democracies are at odds with Russia," listen carefully now, "Romanism diplomatically flirts with some influential Protestant groups or individuals in order to win their support in her fight to maintain her political and religious system throughout the world." So in other words, the papacy was flirting with Protestantism because Protestantism, and the biggest Protestant nation, capitalist, was at this time a deadly enemy of communism, right? So he says that that the Catholic Church was flirting with Protestantism because Protestantism would help them in their enmity against communism. However, Weir also stated in the same book that Roman Catholicism and communism or socialism have many characteristics and objectives in common. Let me read from the book Probation Closes, page 31. We must not forget that communism is more a rival to Romanism than an enemy. Communism has more in common with Romanism than with any other religious body. Communism has what? More in common with Romanism than with any other religious body. You say, how can that be? They're deadly enemies. Continue. Communism has thrived best in Roman Catholic countries. True. Poor Roman Catholic countries. The quotation continues, Rome is therefore much more opposed to the political and international brand of communistic action than it is opposed to its atheistic doctrines. There's a papacy is not against communism because it's atheism, but because communism at that time was considered to be a rival. The quotation ends by saying, what Rome detests is communism, and what it fears most is its anti-Roman policy. So did the papacy dislike communism mainly because, communism is atheistic? No. Because communism was anti-papacy. So what Rome detests is communism, and what it fears most is its anti-Roman policy rather than its anti-Christian philosophy. Are you following me so far? So you say, what similarities are there between communism or socialism and the papacy? I'm going to draw 12 parallels. 12 similarities between communism or socialism and the papacy. By the way, we're not talking only about things that happened in the past. There's a strong move in the United States towards socialism. Now, how does that fit within the scenario of Bible prophecy? Well, you need to continue coming this weekend. There's one presentation that I'm not going to be able to make because we don't have enough presentations, and that is the role that Donald Trump plays in this whole equation. Donald Trump, ill-spoken, fickle as water, among other things, is presently the greatest obstacle that the Roman Catholic papacy has from implementing socialism on a global scale. And I'm going to share that with you a little bit later on. So let's examine the 12 similarities. First, both communism or socialism and Roman Catholicism are imperialistic. What do I mean by imperialistic? They want to establish a world empire. In 1990, A Roman Catholic Jesuit priest, whom I will be referring to quite frequently by the name of Malachi Martin. Have you ever heard that name? He published his best-selling book, which is a really interesting read. He was an intimate friend of John Paul II, by the way. Had almost direct access to him whenever he wanted. Very conservative theologically. And very anti-communist and pro-capitalist. Anyway, in 1990, he wrote his famous book, The Keys of This Blood. That's the title. The subtitle is, listen carefully, Pope John Paul II versus Russia and the West. How many powers are we talking about here? 3. What characterizes the countries of the West? Capitalism. So the subtitle is Pope John Paul II versus Russia and the West for control of the New World Order. So how many systems are struggling for control of the New World Order? 3. Communism or socialism, the papacy, and the capitalist countries of the West. On page 18 of his book, he wrote this, very interesting. You know, this is a book before its time. Ellen White says that the papacy can see the future on the basis of its experience in the past. It's not a prophetic movement. They can prophesy what's going to happen, but they can use the law of cause and effect to kind of suggest what is going to happen in the future. Notice what Martin wrote on page 18 of his book. There is one great similarity shared by all 3 of these globalist competitors. So the 3 globalist competitors have one thing in common. What is it? Each one has in mind a particular grand design for one world governance. What do they have in common? Each one wants to establish an empire that governs the whole world. He continues, their geopolitical competition is about which of the 3, listen carefully now, which of the 3 will form, dominate, and run the world system that will replace the decaying nation system. This brings to mind the Tower of Babel, which is another lecture that I could have presented here on this particular subject. God had told the people at Babel to disperse, but they all came together. They wanted to establish, Ellen White says, a universal empire that would cover the whole earth. So what God did was he confused their languages so that they would establish separate nations. Because it's much more difficult for evil to consolidate when you have many different nations than if you have everybody on the same page because they have the same language and the same culture. And so once again, their geopolitical competition is about which of the 3 will form, dominate, and run the world system that will replace the decaying nation system. And then Malachi Martin states that he knows exactly who's going to win. He says the papacy is going to win. And the reason he gives is that Jesus gave the keys of this blood to Peter and his successors. And the gates of hell will not prevail against the papacy. So he's stating the papacy is going to win this competition. Not communism or socialism, not capitalism. The United States is the primary example of that. And then on page 16, he writes something really scary. He wrote, no holds barred. Because once the competition has been decided, what competition? Between the 3 entities. By the way, have you ever heard read Ellen White's statement where she speaks about a final union between three powers: the papacy, Protestantism, and worldlings. Worldlings means secular. So no holds barred, because once the competition has been decided, the world and all that's in it, our way of life as individuals and as citizens of the nations, our families and our jobs, our trade and commerce and money, remember all of this? Our educational systems, and our religions, and our cultures, even the badges of our national identity, which most of us have taken for granted. In other words, MAGA, make America great again. America first. You know, that stands in the way of the objective of communism and the papacy as well. So once again, all of these things, our families, our jobs, our trade and commerce, our money, our educational systems, our religions, and our cultures, even the badges of our national identity, all will have been powerfully and radically altered forever. In other words, the whole purpose is to control families, jobs, trade and commerce, money, educational systems, religions, cultures. And he says all of this will have been altered radically forever. And then he states, no one can be exempted from its effects. No sector of our lives will remain untouched. Nobody who is acquainted with the plans of these three rivals has any doubt but that only one of them can win. Interesting statement written back in the late 1980s, over 30 years ago, 32, 33 years ago. So the first similarity between the papacy and the communist or socialist or secular world is their imperialism. The second similarity is that they are both totalitarian. Communism and or socialism and the papacy are totalitarian. You say, what does that mean? It means that they want to exercise what? Total control. Therefore, they cannot allow dissent. They might sound now like they're protecting religious liberty and they're in favor of freedom and so on. Don't be fooled, because both of these systems are totalitarian. Communism or socialism vows for absolute control of the world system, of religion, politics, education, economics, the arts, and individual consciences. The harlot of Revelation 17 wants to do the same thing. Because if you read Revelation chapter 17, you'll find that the papal harlot sits on many waters, that is, on the multitudes. She also controls the economy of the world, according to Revelation 18. She also fornicates with the kings of the earth, and she has daughters whom she controls. And who are the daughters? The Protestant denominations. So both of them vie for total control. It's called totalitarianism. The third similarity is that for these two systems, individualism, free enterprise, freedom of speech, and freedom of religion cannot exist once they have full power. Both communism and the papal power are bitter opponents of individualism, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of conscience, and freedom of worship. Why would they be against these? Because in individualism, with all these freedoms, they cannot exercise total and complete control. The fourth similarity is that both of these systems, the papacy and socialism or communism, is that both of them have a system of spying or surveillance. You know, communism had the KGB. For those of you who are not up on the news of what's happening in Venezuela they have an organization called the SEBIN, spies on all political opponents. They've established a system where an individual represents a certain block of the city, and that individual is responsible to keep everybody in line on that block of the city. And of course, the Roman Catholic Church also has a system of surveillance or spying, such as the Opus Dei, which means the work of God, and the Jesuits. We will be speaking more about them in the course of this weekend. Similarity number 5. Both of them despise Protestantism. Why? Because Protestantism is primarily found in countries that are capitalist. And capitalism guarantees freedom of enterprise, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, freedom of political preference, and individualism. The guarantee of these freedoms goes against the grain of totalitarianism. So Protestantism is despised by both the papacy and socialism. Similarity number 6. Both communism or socialism feign an interest for the poor and for human rights. However, both have a deplorable record of accomplishment in both of these areas. Communism and Catholicism thrive in areas of extreme poverty, where there is a small middle class. Therefore, both systems tell rich nations to redistribute their wealth to the poor ones. In Europe, during the 1260 years, there was ignorance, war, disease, social unrest, and persecution. The church enriched itself at the expense of the poor, building huge monuments like, for example, St. Peter's Basilica and the famous basilica or cathedral that had this fire last year, Notre Dame. Most of the money that was used to build those great monuments was at the expense of the poor. In Latin America, how many of you are from Latin America? Raise your hand. We have several here. In Latin America, the papacy has had 500 years to improve the lives of the people and has failed miserably. As you know, thousands have come towards the U.S. in caravans, seeking a better life. So both of these systems, communism or socialism and the papacy, feign an interest for the poor. And yet the governing class have a much higher standard of living than the common people. Both systems are also riddled with corruption. By way of example, my wife is from Colombia, but her family lived for many years in Venezuela. In fact, she still has 2 sisters and a brother that live there. So I'm speaking from personal experience. In Venezuela, the elite socialists or communists, they like to call themselves socialists, but they're really communists. They've pillaged the country. And they've left the country totally bankrupt, stealing not millions but billions of dollars, living in luxury while people are eating from the garbage and barely have 1 meal a day and have no freedoms. You know, communism tried to penetrate Nicaragua in the 80s, 70s, late 70s and early 80s. Let me read you a description that Malachi Martin gave of the lifestyle of the socialists in Nicaragua back in that time. They feigned love for the poor, yeah. By the way, does the present Pope talk a lot about the poor? Oh, yeah. In the book The Jesuits, page 139, 140, and I'll be referring to this book quite a bit this weekend, he describes the lifestyle of the leaders of the socialists in Central America in the 80s. They live in homes expropriated from the ousted middle class. Do you know what expropriate means? In Venezuela, Chavez, he would see this nice piece of land, he would say, expropriate it. He would steal it from the owner. And it now became part of the government. So they live in homes expropriated from the ousted middle class. In comfortable Managua suburbs, such as Las Colinas, Managua is the capital city of Nicaragua, they shop at specially designated hard currency and dollar stores where there is no preferential treatment for the poor. They dine at luxury restaurants restricted to party officials and lunch in their government offices on the daily loads delivered by official vans of ham, lobster, and other delicacies unobtainable elsewhere in Sandinista Nicaragua. They relax in reserved box seats at the baseball stadium, enjoy unlimited supplies of gasoline and water that are rationed to the people, and vacation in the mansions of the Somoza dynasty. Somoza was the dictator that the communists overthrew, suitably rebaptized by the Sandinistas as protocol houses. They travel around their native Nicaragua with personal bodyguards of Cubans and East Germans who are armed with Soviet automatics, ostensibly to be pointed at potential assailants, but presumably equally effective against an activist priest who might waver in his enthusiasm for politics of the Sandinista brand. So they feign a love for the poor. Yeah, we need to distribute all of the resources of the nation equally among everybody. But the leaders don't live that way. By the way, do you know Ellen White wrote that it was never God's plan that poverty should disappear from the earth? So this ideal, you know, there's huge talk about eradicating poverty on the part of the papacy and on the part of the socialist governments of the world. The United Nations is foremost in talking about eradicating poverty from the world by taking money from the rich nations and redistributing it to the poor nations. Notice what Ellen White wrote in Volume 4 of the Testimonies, 551 and 552. It was not the purpose of God that poverty should ever leave the world. It was not the purpose of God, what? It was never the purpose of God that poverty should ever leave the world. The ranks of society are never to be equalized. For the diversity of condition which characterizes our race is one of the means by which God has designed to prove and develop character. Many have urged with great enthusiasm that all men should have an equal share in the temporal blessings of God. But this was not the purpose of the Creator. Christ has said that we shall have the poor always with us. So this ideal of socialism, this ideal of the papacy, is not God's plan. Similarity number 7. Both socialism or communism and the papacy have a long history of persecution. Let me read you a description of what occurred in the former Soviet Union in terms of persecution. Communism persecuting. 1 million imprisoned or exiled between 1927 to 1929. 9 to 11 million peasants forced off their lands. And another 2 to 3 million peasants arrested or exiled in the mass collectivization program. 6 to 7 million killed by an artificial famine in 1932 through 1934. 1 million exiled from Moscow and Leningrad in 1935. 1 million executed during the Great Terror of 1937 and 1938. 4 to 6 million dispatched to labor camps. 10 to 12 million people forcibly relocated during World War II. And at least 1 million arrested for various political crimes from 1946 to 1953. That's the record of communism or socialism, just in the Soviet Union. Did the papacy do the same thing during the 1260 years? You know, Daniel 7, it says that this system would persecute the saints of the Most High. Revelation 13 also emphasizes that. The 5th seal says that the martyrs that were slain by this system cried out, "Until when, O Lord, do you not judge and avenge our blood upon those who shed it on the earth?" Ellen Wright wrote in The Spirit of Prophecy, Volume 4, page 63, the papacy, the mangled forms of millions of martyrs cried to God for vengeance upon that apostate power. So both systems are persecuting powers. Similarity number 8. Both systems oppose God. Really? Yes, in different ways. How does socialism or communism oppose God? Well, they openly say that they're what? We're the atheists. We don't believe in God. The state is God in Marxism or socialism. At least they have the sincerity to say, we are atheists, we don't believe in God. How does the papacy oppose God? 2 Thessalonians 2 says that it sits in the temple of God, showing itself to be God. It doesn't replace God with the state. It replaces God with the Pope. Both of them oppose God. Similarity number 9. Both of these powers, the papacy and socialism or communism, operate by a power from beneath, from the abyss, from below. A satanic power that hates the Bible, despises the Bible. Did the papacy war against the Bible during the 1260 years? Absolutely. Did communism in its heyday also forbid the Bible and persecute those who had Bibles? You know that they did. Both of these systems arise from the bottomless pit, according to the book of Revelation. I want to read from Great Controversy 268 and 269, where Ellen White describes how a power from beneath controlled the papacy during the 1260 years, and how the power from beneath, the power of Satan, did the same in the French Revolution, which gives birth to communism or Marxism. This is how it reads. In many of the nations of Europe, the powers that ruled in church and state had for centuries been controlled by Satan through the medium of the papacy. So what happened during the 1260 years? Satan controlled the nations through the medium of the papacy. And then she speaks about Revelation 11, which speaks about when, in the French Revolution, did the French Revolution war against the Bible? Yeah, Revelation 11 says that it killed the two witnesses. Who are the two witnesses? The Old and New Testaments. So the papacy forbade the reading of the Bible on pain of death. Communism or socialism did the same thing. In France, Ellen White describes in this same statement, but here in Revelation 11 verse 7 is brought to view a new manifestation of satanic power. So there's an old manifestation of satanic power, that's the papacy, during the 1260 years, and then a new manifestation of satanic power, which is French, which wars openly against the Bible. Similarity number 10. Both systems grow, spread, and thrive by establishing and controlling the educational systems to brainwash students to buy into their philosophies. Do you know what's being taught in the universities of the United States of America? The secular public universities? Pure socialism is what is being taught. Does the papacy do the same in the schools that they have? Absolutely. Similarity number 11. And this might surprise you. We're going to discuss it more fully in the course of the weekend. Similarity number 11. Both socialism or communism and the papacy have embraced the evolutionary theory of beginnings. Interesting. Both believe and teach evolution as the origin of the universe and the origin of man. And then fact number 12, this is the comforting part. The book of Revelation explains that both of these systems will be overcome by the Lamb. In Revelation 17 verse 14 it says that Christ will overcome the kings because he is King of kings and Lord of lords. In Revelation chapter 17 says that the civil powers will turn against the harlot. And they will make her naked and desolate. They'll burn her with fire and eat her flesh. That's a way of saying that they're going to really be mad at her when they discover that she has deceived them into merging with her. So are you clear on the similarities? We're just setting the stage tonight. We need to know all of these details tonight for what we're going to be discussing in the 3 sessions tomorrow. Now let's talk about the papacy's world vision. The papacy's world vision. Because ultimately the papacy is going to be the catalyst that will overcome the tension between the papacy, Protestantism, and the secular powers of the world. What is the papacy's world vision? Since the times of St. Augustine, the Roman Catholic Church has two pillars that are the greatest theologians in its history. The first is St. Augustine. He died in the year 430 of the Christian era. And the other, St. Thomas Aquinas, who lived in the 1200s. Unrivaled theologians in the history of the Roman Catholic Church. But since the times of St. Augustine, the Roman Catholic Church has taught that the stone that hits the feet of the image of Daniel 2 is not the second coming of Jesus. You know, the stone hits the feet of the image and the stone becomes a mountain that covers the whole earth. We believe that that represents the second coming and Jesus establishing his everlasting kingdom at his second coming. From the times of St. Augustine till today, the Roman Catholic Church does not believe that in Daniel 2, the stone that hits the image is the second coming, and the mountain represents Christ establishing his kingdom, his eternal kingdom. They believe that the stone that hits the feet of the image and abolishes all of the nations represents the Roman Catholic papacy. And the view is that the papacy will take over the reins of the secular powers of the world and will establish a universal kingdom of peace on earth. Let me read you what Pope Benedict XVI had to say. By the way, how many times have you read or heard Pope Francis refer to the second coming of Jesus as the great hope for planet Earth? Never. Because that is not the Roman Catholic view. Neither is it the view of the United Nations or the socialist communist countries of the world. Their idea is that eventually, through human genius, through international treaties, etc., through a union of these three powers, there's going to be a universal kingdom of peace on earth. That to them is heaven. Notice what Pope Benedict wrote. Man's earthly activity, when inspired and sustained by charity, contributes to the building of the universal city of God, which is the goal of the history of the human family. Now, do you know what the name of the book is that St. Augustine wrote, stating that the stone that hits the image represents the papacy taking all the reins of power in the world? Do you know what St. Augustine called his book? The City of God. So, Pope Benedict is referring to that concept because he says, man's earthly activity, when inspired and sustained by charity, contributes to the building of the universal city of God, which is the goal of the history of the human family. That's what St. Augustine taught. The goal of the history of the human family is the city of God, which is the papacy taking over the powers of the world. He continues, in an increasingly globalized society, the common good and the effort to obtain it cannot fail to assume the dimensions of the whole human family. That is to say, the community of peoples and nations in such a way as to shape the earthly city in unity and peace, rendering it to some degree an anticipation and prefiguration of the undivided city of God. So his view is the view of St. Augustine. Not the second coming of Christ. No, not a millennium where you're going to have the earth without form and void and in darkness. No, 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 no. The evolutionary theory says that the world is going to get better and better under the leadership of the papacy. There's a Reformed scholar by the name of John Robbins, not a Catholic, but he discerned very clearly what the papacy has in mind. In 1999, he wrote a book called Ecclesiastical Megalomania. He warns about the aspirations of the papacy. This is what he wrote. He's not an Adventist. He's of the Calvinistic tradition. What the Roman Catholic Church state accomplished on a small scale during the Middle Ages is what it desires to achieve on a global scale in the coming millennium. What does the papacy want to do? What it did on a small scale in Europe during the 1260 years, it wants to do on a global scale. Remember, this book is being written in 1999. On a global scale in the coming millennium. You know, it's a sobering fact that when Jesus was on the Mount of Temptation, Satan offered Jesus all of the kingdoms of the world, and he refused them. But in the days of Constantine, Satan offered the papacy those same kingdoms, and the papacy accepted. That's the reason why Ellen White refers to the papacy, or the succession of popes, as they consider themselves vicegerents of God. What is a vicegerent? It is a person to whom has been delegated power to act in the place of another person. A vicar, in other words. So when the papacy accepted the political power and mingled it with the church, it accepted what Jesus rejected. It became the emissary of Satan. Jesus, what would have happened if Jesus had accepted? Jesus would have become what? The vicegerent of Satan. But he rejected them. So that's the papacy's world vision for the future. What is the biblical view of the end time? The biblical view is radically different. The Bible tells us that in the end time, the earth will grow old. I'm only going to give you the verses. Isaiah 24, 4 and 5. There will be earthquakes, famines, pestilence, social unrest, and wars. Matthew 24. That will lead to a tribulation such as never has been seen in the history of the world. The abomination of desolation will be set up, which is the Sunday law. And all nations will hate and persecute God's faithful people. That's the end time scenario. Toward the end of the Great Tribulation, 7 devastating plagues will fall upon the earth and reduce the planet to the way it was before creation week. Decreation, in other words. And during the 1,000 years, the earth will be without form and void, and in darkness, with no life. After the 1,000 years, Jesus will come with the New Jerusalem, destroy sin and sinners, and miraculously and supernaturally create a new heavens and new earth. That's the biblical view. Radically different than the Roman Catholic and the socialist view, like day and night. The papacy sees a brilliant future for planet Earth. In the view of the papacy, human ingenuity and international laws will help solve the problems that we have in this world. And as a result, God's kingdom on earth will be established. Let me read you what Pope Francis had to say in a speech that he gave to the United Nations, the 70th anniversary of the General Assembly of the United Nations. Listen carefully to what he says. Among other things, human genius. What does human genius mean? In other words, human intelligence, human wisdom. Among other things, human genius, well applied, will surely help to meet the grave challenges of ecological deterioration and of exclusion of the poor. So according to the papacy, the world will be able to resolve its problems. Human genius will resolve the problems that we presently have. Everybody will come together, and then the city of God will have been built here on earth with the papacy as a moral voice. This radically differs from the biblical perspective. The biblical perspective tells us that we are strangers and pilgrims on this earth, and that the heavenly city is our home. Hebrews 11, verses 13 through 16. The Apostle Paul said, our citizenship is in heaven, from where we expect Jesus to come. By the way, this is the reason why I believe in the book of Revelation. Have you ever noticed the expression, those who dwell on the earth? It always refers to the wicked. The wicked are earth dwellers. This is their permanent home. This is where they focus their hope. Now, just allow me a few extra minutes here. Is that okay? Now, in order to be successful in implementing this vision, the papacy has to work on two fronts. In order to be successful in implementing its world vision, the papacy has to work on two fronts. First, the papacy must get the socialist, globalist, communist powers of the world to feel safe with the papacy. In other words, to get them to merge with the papacy. And you know, as Adventists we say, one of the great signs of the end is that Protestants are going to unite with the papacy. Let me say that there's something else that is even more important from the papal perspective, and that is the papacy needs to get the secular powers of the world to buy into her agenda. Because the deadly wound, folks, the deadly wound was not given to the Roman Catholic Church as a church. Let me ask you, in 1798, when the Pope was taken prisoner, were all the Roman Catholic churches shut down? Or did people keep on taking their children to be baptized, their babies to be baptized? Yes. Did they continue going to partake of the Eucharist? Yes. Did they continue going to confessional? Yes. The deadly wound is not that the Roman Catholic Church was going to cease to exist as a church. The deadly wound is that the civil power of the papacy would be removed. So what does the papacy have to do in order to be successful? It has to get the secular powers to buy into it again and to implement its agenda. Are you with me or not? So the first thing that the papacy needs to do to recover its power, to fulfill its world vision, is to get the secular powers of the world to trust her again. I don't know how our politicians, they must not be reading history. Is the papacy in its essence the same as it always has been? Does she look like she's always been? No, she doesn't look like she's always been. She speaks about the need to help the poor. The Pope washes the feet of the prisoners. He lives in humble quarters. He doesn't even live in the palace. You know, he lives in humble quarters. And everybody says, wow, you know, what a wonderful system. The best description that Ellen White gave of the papacy, actually, it's the best description I've ever read anywhere. She says that beneath the variable appearance of the chameleon. You know what a chameleon is? It's a lizard that changes colors depending on the environment where it is. It's camouflage. So she says, behind the variable appearance of the chameleon is the invariable venom of the serpent. The papacy is the same papacy with makeup and jewelry on to deceive the kings of the earth, just like the harlot deceived Samson. Notice what the Jesuit Malachi Martin wrote in his book, The Jesuits. I'm going to refer a lot to this book tomorrow. In fact, I would recommend that you read it. Not because we accept everything that he's saying, but 32 years ago he was already predicting what's happening today. Not because he's a prophet, but because the Roman Catholic Church has been around for almost 1700 years. So they have all the experience to know if this happens, we know that this is going to happen. He wrote, speaking about the socialists and the papacy, the aim of both, the Jesuits, particularly the Jesuits in the papacy, and the socialist or the globalist. He says the aim of both is to establish a socio-political system affecting the economies of nations. So what do they want to do, both socialism and the Jesuits and the papacy? They want to establish a social-political system affecting the economies of nations. How? By a thoroughgoing redistribution of Earth's resources and goods. Redistribute the goods. And in the process, to alter, listen carefully, to alter the present governmental systems in vogue among nations. Notice what Pope Francis spoke to the Pontifical Academy of the Sciences about his new agenda. In both the encyclical Laudato Si, you know what Laudato Si is, right? It's the Pope's encyclical on the environment, caring for our common home. Every Adventist should read that. There's a lot of good stuff in it. See, I believe there is climate change. And that as Adventists, we should be the foremost in caring for nature. Because we believe God was the creator. We need to take care of what God created. The problem is the agenda behind it. By the way, there is climate change. But the main reason is not fossil fuels. What was the greatest climate change in the history of the world? The flood. And the reason is they were using too many fossil fuels before the flood, right? The wickedness of man was great in the earth, and every intent of their hearts was only evil continually. That's the reason why these disasters are increasing. Can you think of another occasion where there was drastic climate change? How about the days of Elijah? Man, Elijah was using too much air conditioning. No! It was the wickedness that led to 3.5 years of drought. So the Pope said to this Pontifical Academy of the Sciences, in both the encyclical Laudato Si and in the address to the members of the diplomatic corps this year, now listen to his agenda, I drew attention to the global challenges facing humanity. Now what are the global challenges facing humanity according to the Pope? Such as integral development, peace, care for our common home, climate change, poverty, war, migration, human trafficking, organ trafficking, the protection of the common good, and new forms of slavery. Interesting talking points. By the way, any mention here of LGBTQ? Any mention of abortion? Any mention of euthanasia? Any mention of gay marriage? Those were the topics that John Paul II and Pope Benedict addressed almost exclusively. Talking points are totally changed now. Why? We'll study that more tomorrow. Now, give me 10 minutes more, and we'll finish. What talking points does the papacy have in common with the United Nations and the socialist globalist powers of the world? Is the papacy speaking the same language as the United Nations? Yes. First, the need for the world to come together to address what is perceived to be an urgent problem: climate change. Is the papacy foremost in discussing the issue of climate change? Absolutely. The encyclical is the gold standard, not only for the church, but also for the state. Second, the United Nations, as well as the papacy, are talking about the need for open borders of all Western countries with no restrictions or walls. The papacy is behind that. And the socialist powers of the world are behind that. What is the objective of this? The objective is for these nations to lose their national identities to facilitate the globalist and internationalist agenda. Because when you have a large influx of immigrants that are not acquainted with the history of the nation and so on, the national identity becomes diluted. Notably, now listen carefully, you never hear the Pope clamoring for China, India, or Russia to open their borders. Any of you ever heard him say, China, open your borders, you have only Chinese there? Or Russia, open your borders. Or India, open your borders. Never. Who are the ones that are supposed to open their borders? The Western nations. The Pope focuses only on the Western capitalist countries. By the way, how many refugees has the Vatican received? Let me read you from an interesting article that appeared on the Christian Broadcasting Network, CBN. That's Pat Robertson's television program. On their website, they had this interesting article on how the Pope stated that nationalism prevents globalism. That's why Trump is a huge bump in the road right now. And I believe God has given us time. By the way, I'm not saying that we should vote or not vote for Trump. I'm simply making a statement of fact. Trump and the Pope are opposites in every detail. Every single detail. I'll be sharing that with you tomorrow. But if Trump should be not reelected, what could happen? You have a lot of socialist, most of the Democrat candidates trend towards what? Socialism. This is what appeared. First a comment, and then they quote the Pope's own words. This is the comment. Pope Francis is pushing for steps toward a global authority that supersedes the rights of individual countries. Did you understand what that says? Pope Francis is pushing for steps toward a global authority that supersedes the rights of individual countries. In other words, individual countries will lose their rights. All with the goal of pursuing the common good on issues like climate change and immigration. And then it quotes the Pope's own words. Here they are. The nation state cannot be considered as an absolute. The nation state cannot be considered as an absolute, as an island in relation to its surroundings. In other words, no nation is an island. In the current situation of globalization, says the Pope, not only of economy, but also of technological and cultural exchanges, the nation-state, that is individual nations, is no longer able to procure by itself the common good for its population. The common good has become global, and nations must associate for their own benefit. When a supranational, that is something that involves all nations, when a supranational common good is clearly identified, there is need for a special legally constituted authority capable of facilitating its implementation. Are you understanding what this is saying? He's not even trying to hide what the idea is. He continues, think of the great contemporary challenges of climate change, new slavery, and peace. Then he states, the Church observes with concern the re-emergence almost everywhere in the world of aggressive currents toward foreigners, especially immigrants, as well as that growing nationalism which neglects the common good. So what does it say? Nationalism what? Nationalism, he says, neglects the common good. There is a risk of compromising already established forms of international cooperation, undermining the aims of international organizations as a space for dialogue and meeting for all countries on a level of mutual respect, and hindering the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals unanimously approved by the General Assembly of the United Nations on 25 September 2015. The Pope is saying that he is 100% on board with the Sustainable Development Goals that were enunciated by the United Nations in the year 2015 at the 70th anniversary of the United Nations. You know, if you really want to get goosebumps, if you want to read something that's really distressing and disturbing, just Google Sustainable Development Goals, what the United Nations has in mind to implement by the year 2030. Scary stuff. And the Pope has embraced it. So the first talking point, climate change. Second talking point, open borders to dilute national identities so that the world can come together a lot easier. And the third objective, and we'll end with this one, the third objective is eradicating global poverty by redistributing the wealth of the rich nations to the poor. And that way all nations will be poor. I read one statement in closing, written by Malachi Martin in 1987 in his book, The Jesuits. Speaking about the Jesuits and the socialists or the communists, he says the aim of both is to establish a socio-political system affecting the economies of nations by a thoroughgoing redistribution of Earth's resources and goods, and in the process to alter the present governmental systems in vogue among nations. A total transformation of the world to globalism under the moral authority of the papacy. Are you with me? Now, we haven't talked about the second thing that the Pope has to do. He has to win over Protestants. But that will be the topic for the next exciting episode of what we are studying. Tomorrow we'll deal in the morning with some of the socialist catchwords that are used by the papacy, and then we'll talk about the second priority of the papacy, how to win over the Protestants. Ellen White says that the papacy would do it. She said over 120 years ago, she gave us 3 ways in which the papacy is going to be successful. 1, false charity. False charity. So if there's false charity, there must be true charity. What is false charity? Well, let's just be nice and forget what divides us. Uniting on common points of doctrine. That's another. There's 3 things that Ellen White specifically mentions, which we can see happening in the world today. How the great Protestant evangelists, how many times have you ever heard Rick Warren or Joel Osteen or Kenneth Copeland or T.D. Jakes? How many times have you heard them criticize the papacy? You don't hear it because we're supposed to be nice. We're supposed to focus on what unites us, not what divides us. Protestantism has no clout anymore. The Seventh-day Adventist Church is the world's last hope. Now, Jesus, of course, is the last hope. Using this church. Does the devil know it? Oh, yes, he does. Divide and conquer. Has the devil been quite successful in dividing the Adventist church and distracting it from its mission? Yes. And we cannot allow it to happen. We have been chosen for a special purpose. To raise up the standard and the truth, the present truth for this time. And woe to us if we don't, because if we don't, we have no reason to exist. Let's pray. Father in heaven, we thank you for your word. We're thankful also that we can read all of these publications and see how all things are moving toward what you have said in your word. We live in amazing times. Lord, I ask that you will help us to be revived. Fill us with your Spirit. Give us holy boldness to speak the truth in love, because the world is so confused. People's hearts are failing them for fear as they see what is happening. They don't know where things are leading. We do. And people can go to bed at night and they can have peace. So use us, Lord, to share this wonderful message. We ask that you'll be with us as we return to our homes. We pray in the precious name of Jesus. Amen. Amen.